Hey again! Today we'll continue reading chapter 18 of Peak. So if you remember, after Josh took the other climbers up to Advanced Base Camp, they encountered a snowstorm, so they got stuck up there for longer than they had expected. So Zopa, Peak, and Sunjo went up to help them bring down, they had a couple of sick climbers with them, so those three went up to help them bring those climbers down from the camp once the weather cleared. And then immediately after, the next day, Zopa took Peak, Sunjo, and Holly up to Advanced Base Camp on his own. Josh was supposed to, but Josh needed to recover from his extended stay at Advanced Base Camp from the storm. So the three of them went up there to acclimatize because they need to get more prepared to summit Everest. So they made it. They had a little bit of difficulties, but I think they've all recovered now. And when they got back, Peak had letters waiting from his family for him, so he finished his first moleskin and sent it to his family as a form of response. So they'll be updated on all of his adventures. So where we're picking up is with the beginning of his second notebook, which doesn't really make a difference in terms of the story, but this is part 2. Moleskin number 2, chapter 18. Secrets. The meeting is a secret, held at HQ after the other climbers had all gone to sleep. By invitation only, Josh, the film crew, Sparky, Dr. Krieger, Thaddeus Bowen, and Zopa, who had brought Sunjo with him. Sunjo looked a little better, but not much. Josh glared at him, and I thought for a moment he was going to ask him to leave, but he let it go. "Where's Holly?" No one seemed to know. "We're not waiting," Josh said. He turned to Dr. Krieger. "How's Peak's health?" "I think we might have gotten the infection with the antibiotics. As long as it doesn't migrate to his lungs, he should be fine. There were 3 new cases of pneumonia reported in camp today. I suspect it's a secondary infection from the virus. William Blade is one of them. Everyone in his team is sick. They left this afternoon and we quarantined everything they left at their campsite." The news about William Blade and her former entourage was going to please Holly to no end. Josh turned to Zopa. "Can Peak make it to the top?" I was still seriously annoyed with Josh over the letters, and this was not helping. I hate it when people talk about me as if I'm not there. Zopa shrugged. "We will have to see how he does at Camp 4. He was fine at ABC. I wasn't fine at ABC, but I appreciated him saying so. "Thanks for getting him up to ABC, Josh said. "I suppose you'll be heading back to Kathmandu." Zopa gave him another shrug. "What about Holly?" Josh asked. "She's strong," Zopa said. Josh looked a little surprised. I was too. She was fine when she finally got to ABC and on the way down, but I wouldn't have characterized her climb as strong. What was Zopa up to? It won't hurt us to get Holly to the summit," Thaddeus said. "She'll talk and write about it for the rest of her life. Good PR for Peak experience." "I suppose you're right," Josh reluctantly agreed. He pulled a notebook out of his pocket and flipped through the pages. "Okay, we have 10 people to get to the top, counting Peak and Holly. Out of those, 6 or 7 have a decent chance if they hit the weather window right." He looked at Sparky. "Do you have some dates for me yet?" "I'm looking at the week of May 25th through June 4th. Sparky looked over at Zopa. "But astrology might give us a better idea than meteorology." "Any ideas, Zopa?" Josh asked. Zopa shook his head. "I just look up at the sky." This got a laugh from everyone, but I don't think Zopa meant it to be funny. "If your weather prediction is right," Josh said to Sparky, "that doesn't give us much time." He walked to the calendar on the wall. "Peak's birthday is 6 weeks from today. That gives us about 5 weeks to get him into position for a summit attempt, and I'd like to get him up there earlier than that." "I agree," Thaddeus said. "If something happens and Peak can't get to the summit, we might have a chance for a second try." "Thaddeus, there won't be a second chance," Josh said. "Peak either makes it on the first try or he doesn't." Josh was right. Second tries were virtually unheard of on Everest. If you fail, you have to return to base camp. There's not enough oxygen at the other camps to get your strength back and recover. And it takes 3 days to get back to base camp, with a night at Camp 6 and a night at ABC. 5 days at base camp, longer if you're really hammered, then back up, which can take 8 or 9 days, altogether nearly 3 weeks. It would be mid-June before I could make another attempt, long after my 15th birthday. Climbers have been stopped 100 yards from the summit, by weather, exhaustion, or time, and have never made another attempt as long as they lived. Here's what I'm thinking, Josh continued. There's a couple signed up to go to Camp 4, but they're strong enough to go a lot higher. In fact, they have a better chance of getting to the summit than most of the others on the team. If we put them on the 2 scratched permits, it would increase their summit percentage by at least 20%. Did you talk to them? Thaddeus asked. Yeah, but no promises. I wanted to discuss our options first. I think you should send Sunjo to the summit, Holly said, startling all of us. Uncharacteristically, she had slipped into the tent quietly. Who? Josh asked, annoyed. Zopa's grandson, Holly answered. This sure got everyone's attention. We stared at Sunjo and Zopa with our mouths hanging open. I think my mouth was open a little more than the others. Josh looked like he had been slapped in the face. Why hadn't Sunjo told me that Zopa was his grandfather? Sunjo sat with his chin cupped in his hand, seemingly oblivious to our shock. What's your father's name? Josh asked him. His name was Kitar Sherpa, Sunjo answered. I knew him, Josh said quietly. I didn't know he had a son. He looked over at Zopa and gave him his trademark grin. What are you up to? Zopa answered with a shrug. None of us believed him. There was a lot more to this than Josh, Sunjo, and Zopa were letting on. Josh looked back at Sunjo. How old are you? I'm 14 years old, he answered. I think we had just gotten to the main reason Zopa had agreed to leave the Indrayani temple and take me to base camp. Josh was no longer grinning, nor was anyone else, especially me. I considered Sunjo a friend. He must have known about a summon attempt back in Kathmandu. He certainly knew that Zopa was his grandfather. I should have guessed something was up when Zopa outfitted him in my climbing gear. Holly clearly had been let in on the secret, which might explain why Zopa had all but carried her up to ABC. When's your birthday? Josh asked. Sunjo looked at Zopa, who gave him a nod. May 31st. 6 days before my birthday. Josh was visibly relieved, but only for a second. How do we know that? Thaddeus asked. Sunjo reached into the pocket of my parka, and produced a tattered piece of paper sealed in a Ziploc plastic bag. He pulled out the paper and handed it to Thaddeus. This is in Nepalese, Thaddeus said. Josh took it from him and read it over. No, it's Tibetan, he corrected, then looked back at Sunjo. You were born in Tibet? Yes, sir, Sunjo answered. I was 5 when my father managed to get my mother and me across the border into Nepal. I am a free Tibetan. There's no such thing, Josh said. How did you get back into Tibet? You certainly didn't use this. He handed the piece of paper back. Forged documents, Zopa said. Josh swore. Well, your grandson isn't going to be a free Tibetan for long if Captain Shek finds out about the bogus papers, Josh said. They'll arrest him. You'll probably be hauled away, too. This explained Sunjo's disappearing act whenever the soldiers were around. A summoned attempt is worth the risk, Zopa commented. Josh looked at Sunjo for a moment, then back at Zopa. I owe you, Zopa, but I haven't decided if Sunjo's getting a shot at the top. And besides, we don't have enough climbing Sherpas to get 3 teams to the top. And that's what we're talking about. 3 separate teams. Yogi and Yash, Zopa said. Josh laughed and looked at it and shook his head. You had this all figured out before you left Kathmandu, didn't you? Zopa didn't answer, but it was clear he had. Maybe you and I should go someplace a little more private to talk about this, Josh suggested. That is up to you, Zopa said, but I don't mind speaking about it here. Suit yourself. Josh looked at everyone in turn, but lingered when he got to Holly. This is totally off the record. Nothing we say here is to leave this tent, and I mean ever. If the Chinese get wind of this, they could shut down our expedition, but worse, they might grab Sunjo and put him in prison. I thought of the shackled road gang we had passed after we crossed the Friendship Bridge, and gave an involuntary shudder. I was mad at Sunjo, but I didn't wish that on anyone. Being arrested in the U.S. was nothing like being arrested in Tibet. I looked at him. He seemed worried, almost as if it had just dawned on him what could happen if Captain Shek caught him with false papers. Everyone nodded in agreement, although I think the film crew would have loved to have their camera rolling. Not that Josh would have let them use any of the footage in the final documentary. Sunjo's mother was born in a small village on this side of the mountain, Zopa explained. My son met her on an expedition. It took him years to get her and Sunjo out of Tibet into Nepal. Sunjo is both Tibetan and Nepalese. The Chinese won't see it that way if Sunjo gets caught up here, Josh said. If we put him on the summit, they'll never give us a climbing permit for the north side again, Thaddeus shouted. That could take away half our business. The Tibet route is harder than the Nepal route. It has more prestige. By bringing Sunjo here, you've jeopardized our entire season. And for what? If Peak and Sunjo make it to the top, Sunjo still won't be the youngest to reach the summit. But he would be the youngest free Tibetan to summit, Zopa pointed out. It's a matter of national pride. We're in business, Thaddeus said, not politics. What's the difference? Zopa said. Enough, Josh said. He looked over at JR. How's the filming going? Okay, JR answered. We have some decent climbing sequences, a couple of good interviews. I cringed a little hearing this. He couldn't be talking about the interviews with me. Any footage of Sunjo? A lot. He and Peak have been climbing together. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, Josh said. He looked over at me. How do you feel about sharing the glory? You've got to be kidding me, Thaddeus said. Josh ignored him. What do you think, Peak? I wasn't doing this for the glory. Or was I? I looked over at Sunjo and Zopa. They were both stone-faced. I was furious with both of them. Sunjo more than Zopa, because Zopa never told anybody anything. I wanted to tell Josh to send Sunjo packing back to Nepal, but instead, without much enthusiasm, I said, It's okay with me. Can I talk to you, Josh? Thaddeus asked. Alone? Sure. After they left, everyone sat there for a few moments without saying anything. JR finally broke the silence. Poker? He pulled a deck of cards out of his parka. Might as well, Sparky said. Josh and Thaddeus could be a while. I'm in, Holly said. I walked over to where Sunjo and Zopa were sitting. Thank you for supporting me, Sunjo said. You should have told me. I did, Sunjo said, glancing at Zopa guiltily. At least indirectly. What are you talking about? Our first night at ABC, he answered. I talked about how if we got up to Camp 4, we had a good chance at the summit. He was right about it being indirect. I barely remembered the one-sided conversation. That's pretty lame, I said. Zopa came to his defense. Sunjo did not know in Kathmandu, he said. He thought I was taking him here to become a Sherpa. It wasn't until we were on our way to ABC that I told him about the summit. So Josh and I weren't the only ones Zopa played cagey with. I glanced over at the poker game, which was in full swing with a pile of money in the center of the table. They were lucky Zopa wasn't playing. I'm going over to the mess tent for some tea, Zopa said. I waited until he was out of the tent, then asked Sunjo why he hadn't told me that Zopa was his grandfather. Zopa thought it best if we kept that to ourselves, he answered. If Zopa had asked me to keep something to myself, I probably would have too, but it still bothered me that Sunjo didn't tell me. Zopa returned with a thermos of tea and several mugs. I took my mug over and watched them play poker. I wasn't really interested in the game, but I didn't want to hang with Zopa and Sunjo. Holly won every hand, much to everyone's annoyance. About 20 minutes later, Josh and Thaddeus came back into HQ. At first I thought Thaddeus had gotten his way because he was all smiles. Sunjo noticed his expression too, and looked disappointed. All right, Thaddeus said, smiling at Sunjo and Zopa. You've got your shot at the summit. You're all heading back up to ABC the day after tomorrow, Josh added. The film crew groaned. Chapter 19. Bear and Bull. 3 teams. A, B, and C. We were the C team. Sunjo, me, the film crew, and Holly, led by Zopa, Yogi, and Yash. I guess the brothers had not hitched a ride to find a job on the mountain. They already had a job. Zopa had hired them to help him get Sunjo to the summit. And I think the C stood for covert, not third, because we were getting the first summit shot, not the last, and somehow we were supposed to keep all of this quiet. The night before, Josh and Thaddeus hadn't told us to outright lie to the other climbers, but they came pretty close to it. We'll have to keep this to ourselves, Thaddeus had said, lowering his voice despite the fact that it was 10 degrees below zero outside and the wind was howling down the mountain at about 25 miles an hour. It wasn't likely someone was standing outside the flat eavesdropping. Thaddeus is right, Josh agreed. Some of the other climbers are real head cases. There'll be a fight over who goes first. It's ridiculous, but it's the same every year. They can't get it into their oxygen-starved brains that reaching the summit has nothing to do with the order you climb. It depends on the weather. Josh was fudging this a little. Sitting at base camp or up at ABC waiting your turn increases your chances of catching a virus or twisting an ankle, to say nothing of the sheer boredom and psychological damage of lying in your cramped tent day after day, wondering if you are going to make it to the top. We are getting the first shot because of my birthday. Period. It could take every one of those 31 plus 30 plus days to get me to the top before I turn 15. In case anyone asks, Thaddeus said, this is what we're doing. He looked at the film crew. You're making a documentary about Sherpas. He looked at Holly. You're writing a story about Sherpas. He looked at me. You're just tagging along to help with the filming. As far as anyone knows, a summit attempt is not part of the documentary. Sunjo's going to have to move to the porter camp tonight, Josh said. It's the only way that we can keep him under wraps. Can you arrange that, Zopa? Zopa nodded. Josh looked at Sunjo. Captain Shek and the soldiers rarely go to the porter camp, but just to be safe, you need to dress and act like a porter. No fancy Western climbing clothes. The porters are hauling supplies up the mountain the day after tomorrow. You'll all go with them. When you get to intermediate camp, out of sight of the Chinese, you can change into your climbing gear. When you come back down, you'll need to change your clothes and stick with the porters. If Shek catches you, you're toast. Toast? Sunjo asked. You'll be chipping boulders into gravel, I explained. Oh. A look of dread crossed Sunjo's usually calm and cheerful face. So, Josh continued, Zopa will lead the C team. I'll lead the A team, and Pa Song will lead the B team. I was disappointed that I couldn't be trying for the summit with my father, but I wasn't surprised. Change of plans had been the theme of our relationship my whole life. I was also worried about Zopa and Sunjo. Paranoia feeds on thin air. That's a direct quote from one of Josh's climbing books, and the feeling was beginning to gnaw at my guts. With Sunjo in the mix, it seemed to me that he and Zopa had everything to gain if I didn't make it to the summit. I'm not saying they would try to stop me, but even the slightest mistake, accidental or intentional, could end my climb, and no one would be the wiser. Bad things happen on mountains. It's part of every climb, and when something goes wrong, it's usually blamed on bad equipment, bad weather, bad luck, rarely on the climbers themselves. Any questions? Josh asked. I had a couple dozen questions, like, if Zopa could get forged papers good enough to get Sunjo over the Friendship Bridge, why should we trust his tattered birth certificate? He could be 6 months younger than me for all we knew. Zopa knew exactly when my birthday was. He was there when Mom radioed Josh on Annapurna. Was Josh hedging his bets by sending Sunjo up with me? If I didn't make it, Josh's company would still receive the credit for getting the youngest climber to the top of Mount Everest. Sunjo was on his climbing permit. Did it really matter to Josh which of us made it to the top? But I didn't ask questions or even make a comment. I was so confused and mad I couldn't trust myself to open my mouth. There's no way we'll be able to keep this a secret from the other climbers, JR said. There's only one final approach to the summit, and we'll all be taking it. Single file, like ants. Josh gave him the grin. No worries. Once the A and B teams get to Camp 4, the only thing they'll be thinking about is where their next breath is coming from. What about when they get back to base camp? JR asked. If they make it to the summit, they won't care who made it to the top and who didn't, Josh answered. The important thing is to give them a good chance. Your team will be 4 or 5 days ahead of A and B. When you get above Camp 4, be careful what you say on the radio. One slip of the tongue and everyone on this side of the mountain will know what we're up to. When you pass us on your way down, don't say anything about the summit. We'll sort it out later. The other climbers are done with their second trip to ABC, JR persisted. They're at least a week ahead of us in terms of acclimatization. He was right. The third trip to ABC was when you usually tried for the summit. We were a trip behind Josh's other climbers. If the weather breaks our way, we'll try to get them to the top sooner, Josh said. If not, they'll have to wait it out in base camp along with everyone else. We can't all head to the top at the same time. There isn't enough room. Which meant the other climbers could be sitting at base camp for another 6 weeks before getting their shot at the summit, and I knew that would not sit well with them. I had a lousy night lying in my sleeping bag, thinking of all the ways Zopa and Sunjo could sabotage my summit try if they wanted to. It was a depressingly long list. Late the next morning, when I finally poked my head out of my tent, a light snow was falling. I got dressed and went over to the mess tent, where I found Zopa and the film crew talking quietly about the shift and documentary. Or were they talking about me until they saw me walk up? Josh was sure right about that thin air paranoia thing. Are you sick again? Zopa asked. Don't you wish, I thought, but told him that I had never felt better in my life. He didn't look like he believed me. I dished up a bowl of oatmeal, then took a seat at the table next to him. We had the tent to ourselves except for the cook cleaning up after the breakfast rush. As soon as you finish eating, JR said, I'll show you how to use the camera. Why? Because there's a decent chance that Jack, Will, and I won't make it to the summit. Someone has to get it on film. They were all strong climbers. It hadn't occurred to me that they might not make it to the top. We'll try, Jack said, but you never know. This is my third trip to Everest, JR said. The closest I've gotten was just above Camp 6. The weather turned us back, and that was it. I'll give you one of our mini cameras. He looked at his watch. We'll meet you and Zopa outside HQ in 15 minutes, then head over to the Porter camp to shoot some footage. They got up and left the tent. I looked at Zopa. Have you seen Josh? He took some of his team up the mountain to practice climbing techniques. I must have looked a little annoyed because Zopa studied me for a moment, then said, How do you feel about your father now that you've spent time with him? I haven't really spent that much time with him, I answered, dodging the question. Zopa sipped his tea, then said, He can't help himself, you know. What do you mean? In climbing, he has found something he is very good at, something he has a passion for. Not many men find that. But what do you do when you get too old to climb mountains? Zopa laughed. Most climbers do not get old. You did. I stopped climbing. Why? My children were grown. I no longer needed the money. You must have climbed for more than money. Of course, but if I wasn't paid, I would not have climbed at all. You climb for sport. Sherpas climb to support their families. So you're here to help Sunjo become a Sherpa, I said. No, I'm here so Sunjo does not have to become a Sherpa. What do you mean? I know you're angry at me for not telling you about my plan for Sunjo, and you're upset with Sunjo for not telling you that I am his grandfather. What does that have to do with your not wanting Sunjo to become a Sherpa? To get him this far, there were things I had to keep to myself, things I had asked Sunjo to keep to himself. He really didn't know what I had in mind until I told him at ABC. I could not tell him until I saw how he did on the mountain. If he makes it to the summit, the notoriety it brings him will allow him to go back to school. I'm hoping he never has to climb again. Is that birth certificate real? Yes. Sunjo is a week older than you. What if I make it to the summit too? Zopa shrugged. This was not the answer I was hoping for. I know what you're thinking, I said. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Zopa smiled and got up from the table. I'll see you over at HQ. I'm going to make it to the summit, I told him as he walked out of the mess tent. In a strange way, the conversation helped to center me. It reminded me that climbing, even though there might be other people in your party, is a solo sport. Your legs, your arms, your muscles, your endurance, your will are yours alone. A partner can encourage you, maybe even stop you from falling, but they can't get you to the top. That's entirely up to you. I finished my breakfast feeling a little better and walked over to HQ to meet the film crew. Zopa was there, but Holly wasn't. She's already over at the Porter camp, JR explained. Dr. Krieger had some meds for Sunjo, but didn't want to take them to the camp herself. Captain Sheck would find that suspicious. Doctors do not treat porters. Holly took them over for her. I guess I wasn't the only one being transformed by the mountain. Holly had undergone a remarkable change since we got up to ABC, and it was clear by JR's attitude that I wasn't the only one to notice. Her voice was still a little shrill, and she still wore her garish clothes, but she had taken care of me at ABC, and now she was looking after Sunjo. I don't think she would have done that on the first day she got to base camp. JR handed me a small camera about the size of a sandwich. I know it doesn't look like much, he explained, but it's reliable at high altitudes and makes a pretty good video. But not as good as the one we've been using, but hauling the big unit to the summit is a pain in the ass. He showed me how to use the zoom in and out, how to frame a shot, how to use the built-in microphone, and how to change the memory card, which held about an hour of video. You have to be pretty close to pick up a voice, Jack explained, especially if the wind's blowing. Whoever's talking will probably have to shout. Consider the camera yours until the climb is over, JR said. We have another one we'll take to the top if we make it that far. You need to practice with it. The hardest part is hitting the little buttons with gloves on, so practice with gloves. If you take off your gloves above Camp 5, your fingers will fall off and you'll be pushing buttons with your nose for the rest of your life. Pleasant thought. What am I supposed to be filming? I asked. The story, Will said. What story? That's the big question, JR answered, and part of the fun. And the mystery, Jack added. Josh hired us to film you, JR continued. Now Sunjo's been added to the mix, which changes the story. If you and Sunjo don't make it to the summit, the story will shift again. It might be about how you didn't make it, what stopped you. It might be about the friendship between you two, which is pretty shaky at the moment, but I didn't tell JR that. Or Sunjo and Zopa, or you and your father. The point is that we don't know what the story is about until we know how the story ends. All we can do now is film details. When we get done, we'll piece the documentary together like a jigsaw puzzle. Which is exactly how Vincent at GSS taught me to put a story together. He wouldn't let me write a word until I'd finished my research. Hold the story inside until you are ready to burst. He made me write my research notes on 3x5 cards. On each card was a scene, a character note, or a detail for my research. When you do your research, write down whatever interests you, whatever stimulates your imagination, whatever seems important. A story is built like a stone wall. Not all the stones will fit. Some will have to be discarded, some broken and reshaped. When you finish the wall, it may not look exactly like the wall you envisioned, but it will keep the livestock in and the predators out. I wondered if Vincent would accept a documentary in place of a moleskin, but I doubted it. It'd be great, JR continued, if you could write down your shots. It's not easy to do, especially at high altitudes, but it would help us when we edit. If you can't write them down, Jack suggested, you can record what you're doing on the microphone. From a distance, the Porter camp looked neat and prosperous, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was neither. It seemed that everything in it was made out of cast-offs, as if the Porters hung around after the climbing season and collected the leftovers from our camp and put it in theirs. There were a couple of shacks that had more flattened tin cans nailed to them than wood. The tents were sewn together from bits and pieces of other tents. The yak halters were made from frayed climbing ropes. The camp had a different smell to it as well. Dung, wood smoke, and the old palm oil that porters cooked their food in. But the smell and disarray were soon forgotten in the minor stampede of men that came running when they saw Zopa. Sunjo and Holly came out of a battered tent and joined us. Sunjo still looked pretty weak, which I wasn't unhappy to see. I wondered how he was going to do tomorrow when we headed back up to ABC. He pulled me to the side. I appreciate your standing up for me last night, he said. I am sorry I didn't tell you about Zopa. Forget it, I said, although I hadn't come close to forgetting it myself. How was it staying here last night? It's not as comfortable as the climbing camp, but the porters have been kind. The porters had lined up in a long row, and Zopa was walking down the line, greeting each in turn and giving blessings. When he finished, we sat down in a large circle on the blankets and sleeping bags and talked, with Zopa translating. A good way to understand what the porters do for a living is to think of them as Himalayan truckers. The only difference is that their trucks have legs instead of wheels and are fueled by grass instead of diesel. The nearest restaurant to our cabin in Wyoming was a truck stop. Mom and I used to go there all the time, and we loved it. The truckers were friendly, funny, and full of stories. It was no different with the porters. I got so involved in their stories, I completely forgot about using my camera. The porters were from all over Tibet and Nepal and spent 9 months out of the year away from home. When they weren't hauling gear up Everest and other mountains, they were guiding trekkers or moving supplies at lower altitudes. Most of the younger porters wanted to become climbing Sherpas because the money was better. The older porters seemed satisfied driving their yaks in spite of the hardships. They told us stories about falls and getting lost, but the most grim story was related at the end of the day by an old porter named Gulu, who was from the same village where Sunjo was born. Gulu knew Sunjo's mother well and claimed to have taken Sunjo on his first yak ride when he was a baby. The porters and Sherpas were spread out over thousands of barren miles, but there always seemed to be connections like this between them. On the way back to camp, JR said that Gulu's story was compelling, but he couldn't use it in the final documentary. No room, which is why I include it here. Vincent taught me that what makes a story unique is not necessarily the information in the story, but what the writer chooses to put in or leave out. When Gulu was a young man, he bought a beautiful yak bull from a distant village. It had taken him 3 years to save money for the bull, which he planned to use to increase the size of his small herd. It was a long distance to the village where the yak was being sold, Gulu said, shaking his gray head. The Chinese soldiers were everywhere, and it was dangerous on the road. I traveled at night and hid in the hills during the day so they did not rob or kill me. It took him so long to get to the village that he was afraid the bull would be gone when he got there, either sold to another buyer or killed by the soldiers for food. But the bull was there, he said, and more magnificent than I remembered. His hair was as dark as a moonless night, his back was as straight as a floor timber, and broad as I am tall. He laughed. The owner regretted the price we had agreed upon, and tried to raise it. They argued for 3 days. In the end, Gulu gave the owner all the money he had, and a promise to bring him the first 2 calves the bull produced the following year. All of this took too long, Gulu explained. The weather had turned bad. To complicate things, I now had a yak with me that had been pastured for over a year with very little exercise. He was weak in the legs from being penned. I had to stop often for him to rest and eat. The other difficulty was that I had no money and I myself had to scavenge for food. He decided the only way he would make it home before he and the yak starved was to take a shortcut through the mountains. He had heard about the shortcut, but never traveled it. At first the route was good. It was far enough from the roads so that I could travel during the day without fear of soldiers. Then the path started to rise. The weather worsened the higher we climbed. The snow was deep. I should have turned back. He grinned and shrugged. But I was young and foolish, and I continued to climb, driving the bull before me. They reached the shortcut summit and started down the other side, Gulu confident now that he and the bull were going to make it home safely. But as he was looking for a place to sleep, an avalanche roared down the mountain and buried him alive. I was so cold, Gulu said with a shudder. More cold than I have ever been in my life, before or since. I remember thinking how unfair it was that the avalanche hadn't killed me when it struck. I waited for death in that cold, dark place, wondering how long it would be. After a while, I felt a tugging on my right arm, like a fish nibbling on bait. At first I didn't know what it was, then I remembered the bull. When we reached the summit, I had put a rope around its neck to keep him close. It wasn't a long rope, 2 meters maybe, a little shorter. He was close and he was alive, but was he above me or below? The snow was so tight around me I didn't know if I was face down or face up. I could have been standing on my feet for all I knew, or upside down on my head. We all laughed, but being buried alive isn't funny. I'm not sure why, Gulu continued, but it seemed important to reach the bull, to touch him one last time, to apologize for taking him from the safety of his pasture. I started to pull myself along the rope. It was slow and painful work. The farther I got up the rope, the harder the yak pulled, sometimes smashing my face into the ice before I could clear it away. Perhaps the bull is free, I thought, standing on the surface, tethered by the man beneath. I finally broke through, gasping for breath. The bull was on the surface, but he was not standing. As I examined him, he kicked me several times, but I was so numb I barely felt it. My beautiful bull had 2 broken legs. I felt shards of bone sticking through his flesh. There was only one thing to do. I unsheathed my knife and cut his throat. The bull took a long time to bleed out. Gulu watched with tears freezing to his cheeks. 3 years of hard work and sacrifice lay at his feet, bleeding into the snow. But there was no time for sorrow, he told us. I had to get back to my village. If I didn't, my family would have to pay the debt of the 2 calves. But first I had to survive the night. He slit the yak open, pulled his guts out onto the snow, then climbed into the body cavity to warm himself. Early the next morning, my sleep was interrupted by a violent shaking. I thought the yak was slipping down the mountain. I put my head outside the carcass, and I don't know who was more surprised, I or the bear pulling my precious bull down the mountainside. It reared up on its hind feet and let out a heart-stopping bellow that shook every bone in my body. I was certain I would be eaten, but I was saved by the Chinese army. 4 soldiers had been tracking the bear and caught up to it just as it bellowed. They fired and missed, but the bullets were enough to frighten the bear away. It lumbered up the slope and disappeared into the trees. All I had to do now was to contend with the soldiers, Gulu said, but I didn't think this would be a problem. I had no money. If they wanted the yak for food, they were welcome to it. As they reached the carcass, I crawled out from my bloody shelter. When they saw me, the soldiers screamed like frightened children and threw down their rifles. Before I could speak, they ran away. After Gulu returned home, he heard a rumor about 4 soldiers coming across a yeti feeding on a yak. A few weeks later, there was a story about a cow giving birth to a full-grown man. How did you pay for the calves? J.R. asked. Gulu smiled. I sold the soldiers' rifles. There was enough money to pay for the calves and to buy a new bull. He is not nearly as magnificent as the one that gave birth to me, but he was a good breeder and increased my small herd tenfold. That's the end of chapter 19. In the next video, we'll continue with chapter 20.